want to begin with a statement that is sort of in the background of this entire series about the last days of Jesus. And honestly, it runs in the background of the significance of Holy Week to begin with. It's this, 5 words: all days are not equal. We don't remember every day. We don't remember the specific events of every day of our lives in the same way. In fact, many of us would go weeks or months and we wouldn't be able to tell you an exact day that almost anything happened. But there are some days that are different. We all have birthdays. Sometimes maybe like our wedding day is one of those days where we remember vivid details, unforgettable details. The day of the birth of one of your children is often one of those days. Sometimes it's not even quite as happy. Maybe like the day of the funeral of a close loved one, or the day that you lost your job. All days are not equal. Some days are far more memorable than others. As a kid, I remember growing up and hearing older folks tell me about vivid memories they had, clothes they were wearing on the day they found out that John Kennedy had been assassinated, or even younger me, almost everyone I know can remember where they were when they found out that the World Trade Center had been bombed on September 11th, 2001. And in fact, I think a more recent example, in terms of its just incredible significance, almost everybody will be able to remember where they were when they heard the news that Charlie Kirk had been shot and killed. There are these days that are marked by events, and they're just different than other days. Some days are more equal than others. All days are not equal. And again, that's the idea that's running in the background of the last days of Jesus, that some days are milestones and some days are sacred. And we want to remember these days as holy days. We want to reenact and recall like what was happening in the life of Jesus as he moves toward his crucifixion and his resurrection. Well, if you're watching this video the day that it's posted, it is for all of us Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday is sometimes called Passion Sunday, and I intentionally saved this teaching so that it would fall on Palm Sunday and it would begin to feel like we're really starting to step into this running through the last 8 days in the life of Jesus. And Passion Sunday is interesting. Palm Sunday is interesting because it's almost 2 days in one, and it becomes like a trigger that sets into irreversible motion the suffering and the death of Jesus. For Jesus and his disciples, life is about to get really weird. It's going to get really weird for the city of Jerusalem. But what's fascinating is on the morning of Palm Sunday, you really wouldn't have had a clue what was about to transpire in the days to come. That's what I want to talk to you about today. Well, hey, welcome. My name is Nicholas Hecht. I've recently started a ministry called Shake the Gates, and significant part of what we're trying to do is to help people not only live like Jesus, but think like Jesus. I'm pretty convinced that we're all called to be disciples, but you can't do discipleship unless you're teaching people both how to live biblically and how to think biblically. We want to not only imitate the actions of Christ, but we want to have the mind of Christ. We want to think the way that Jesus thought. And so everything that we do, including this teaching series leading up to Easter, is intended to help us think through the lens or with a value system that would be consistent with what Jesus taught us to be thinking. Anyway, I'm glad you're tuning in. I think it's important that we're watching videos like this online, and just glad you're with us. And I hope you'll continue to investigate Jesus and the gospel and all of those things even deeper. Now, in the first century, on Palm Sunday, the population of Jerusalem would have swelled to about 20 times its normal size. Now, first century estimates day to day are kind of all over the place, but best guesses are that the city of Jerusalem, the population of that city was probably somewhere between 50,000 and maybe 250,000 people that lived there, called that city home year in and year out. But during these major feasts, the population would swell to maybe 1.5 million or 2 million people, 20 times, their normal daily population. This was, Palm Sunday is leading into the week of Passover, and this would have been a week when pilgrims all over the known world would be coming to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices to God. On Maundy Thursday and on Good Friday, we talked about this sacrificial system that God had set in place to allow his people to be reunited with him, right? To seek forgiveness and atonement for their sins. So there would have been people everywhere. There would have been animals everywhere. And it would have just been this kind of buzz of chaos and energy and expectation. Now, I want to turn to Matthew chapter 1, and I want to begin to read some of this story. Matthew 21, and I'm going to start reading at verse 1. You can follow along. As they approached Jerusalem, this is Jesus and his disciples, as they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there, with her colt by her. Now untie them and bring them to me. And if anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." Now this took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. This would be Zechariah. "Say to daughter Zion, see your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Now the disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them, and they brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven." And when Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." Now, it's Palm Sunday, and on this particular morning, a Galilean is entering the city on the back of a donkey. But that donkey is carrying more than just the flesh and bones of a Jewish carpenter. See, what's happening, some of the buzz around the city is that rumors have begun to spread. Is this the one that we've been waiting for? We mentioned that prophecy from Zechariah 9:9. "Behold, the king comes, your Messiah comes, gentle and seated, riding on a donkey." Now, if we were to all have hopped on some planes last night and had an agreement that we were going to meet in Tel Aviv this morning, on the morning of Palm Sunday, we all walked out of that airport together and got on a bus together, and we drove maybe an hour over to the Temple Mount, and we walked up to the Mount of Olives. Even today, there would be a man waiting on that mountain with a donkey for the Messiah to come. I believe it's a practice that still continues to this day. There's expectation that this prophecy from Zechariah is going to be fulfilled. Jesus, throughout his life, is going to spend very little time actually in the holy city throughout his life, but already upon his entrance into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, or coming over the Mount of Olives, there are some indications that are consistent with his life, but also that are indications about the kind of kingdom he is ushering in. Jesus does not enter the city of Jerusalem riding on a steed or a large, powerful horse, as you might expect a king, in particular the king of the world, to come in on, but instead he comes in on a donkey. Now, I don't know if any of you have any experience riding donkeys. I do. As a boy, my grandpa and Grandpa Hecht had a farm in eastern Michigan, and they had some horses, and they also had a donkey. And I can remember that when I was 6, the family was going on a horse ride, and I was chosen to ride the donkey. And man, it's not just that donkeys are slow, it's that they're so frustrating, and they won't do anything that you ask them to do. They don't follow instructions. They just kind of move in their own direction at their own pace. In fact, when I was 6, I think this donkey turned its head around and bit my foot. It was not a pleasant experience. I think there's almost maybe even some sort of metaphor for the people who are going to be making up this crowd and cheering for Jesus, and the temperament of a donkey, that they just kind of don't follow reason. They do what they want. They're stubborn and thick-headed and unpredictable and frustrating. Well, Jesus rides into the city, coming over the Mount of Olives, and then something very fascinating begins to happen. Something very weird. The people who are gathered there actually begin to celebrate the wrong Jewish feast. Now, there are 7 Jewish feasts, and there are 3 primary feasts. There's the Feast of Passover, which is what's being celebrated here. It's the week of Passover here in Matthew 21. It's sometimes called the Feast of Pesach. This remembers when God delivered the people of Israel from Pharaoh in Egyptian captivity by sending the spirit of death to kill the firstborn of every household. The Jewish people were spared by the blood of the lamb that was spread over their doorposts. So there's the Feast of Passover. There's also the Feast of Pentecost, which takes place 7 weeks after Passover. It's sometimes called in Hebrew Shavuot. And then the third major feast is the Feast of Sukkot, or the Feast of Booths, sometimes called the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, what's interesting about what's happening here is in the midst of the week that's leading up to Passover, the people begin behaving as if they're celebrating the Feast of Sukkot. It's Palm Sunday. Imagine if 1 week from today you walked into church on the morning of Easter Sunday and you found that the musicians on stage were singing Christmas hymns and there were Christmas trees around the lobby decorating the building, and the pastor stood on stage and he began to preach a sermon about the birth of Jesus and about Joseph and Mary in the manger. Imagine how confused you would be. And that is some of what we should be noticing here as Jesus comes over the Mount of Olives on the morning of Palm Sunday. This scene has its roots in the tradition of the Feast of Booths, when palm branches were brought into Jerusalem to celebrate. Now, all of these feasts have both theological and then agricultural meanings. They're theological because they're remembering things that God did. They're teaching us about God. But then they also have these agricultural components because God is seen as their provider. During the Feast of Booths, it gets its name because the people would, even still they do this, would go out into the wilderness and the area surrounding their cities, and they would build these temporary structures, small little booths. To me, they kind of look like deer hunting blinds that I'd seen as a kid when I was in Israel. But they build these small booths that have no ceiling, they open to the sky, they have no roof, and they're intended to remind the people of what life was like for the Jews and the Israelites when they were wandering in the wilderness. And they had to rely on God for everything. They had nothing covering them except the Father who was looking out for them. And so the tradition even today is that Jewish people will go on a little miniature camping trip and they'll build these booths and then they'll sleep in them for 8 days leading up to the final day of the Feast of Sukkot. It's an 8-day festival, and it begins to kind of crescendo in intensity with each consecutive day. Again, the meaning behind this is that the people of Israel would be thanking God for his provision over the last year, that God has provided, that he has raised up crops for us to harvest. But they're also praying that God will continue to provide, that he will send rain in the year to come. So it's a festival that remembers and hopes, remembrance and hope. And the feast begins as the priests begin to light these enormous menorahs that would have dominated the skyline in Jerusalem. In ancient Jerusalem, there would have been 75-foot tall menorahs that just illuminated the entire city. The Feast of Sukkot begins when the priests set fire to the olive oil that fills these menorahs, and it lights up the city. And then there are these daily parades and processions into the temple, up to the altar, where the priest would pour out living water. Water that makes the crops grow, would pour out water as a drink offering to the Lord. And the people would gather with the priest and they would move through the city shouting and singing on their way to the altar. And again, each day this gets louder and louder. The people are singing and they're shouting what's called the Hallel, Psalms 113 through 118, likely memorized for them, but they're singing these words that are claiming God's faithfulness and God's goodness. And they end with, Psalm 18 ends with some very familiar phrases. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. See, Sukkot celebrates the God who literally pours out the heavens for his people. He sends rain and our crops grow. And because our crops grow, we can feed our children. Our children won't starve. They have food to eat. The feast even has its own sound effects. And this is part of the reason the palm branch has become a part of, right, Palm Sunday. It's borrowed from the feast of Sukkot. Have you ever wondered why the people cut branches from the trees and laid them on the ground as Jesus was coming over the Mount of Olives? Now, my wife and I went to one of our favorite stores, our family's favorite stores, Hobby Lobby, a few days ago, last week. And I bought these palm branches for the sake of this video. And I probably at some point as a little kid in church carried some of these on Palm Sunday in the church, waving them around. But it's worth pointing out here that the type of branches that would have been used during the Feast of Sukkot and likely on Palm Sunday would not have been these, 18-inch long green branches, but rather 6 to 8 foot long dried out palm branches. And it was important that they were dried out because they were going to be used for the noise that they made. When the people were dancing and moving through the streets of Jerusalem, they would have these large palm branches and they would be sort of shaking them as they walked. Now imagine the sound of a 6 to 8 foot long dried out palm branch, leaves rustling as you're dancing, and then imagine tens of thousands of people doing this. What it would do is it would create sort of the sound of a rainstorm. And that's what the feast is calling for agriculturally, that God would send rain. How many of you ever had a moment maybe at a summer camp or in your school or church growing up where you would do that thing where you'd have a large group of people in a room and the leader up front would say, okay, I want this section over here to start sort of stomping your feet against the ground. And then he'd go to the middle section and say, I want this section here to start patting your hands on your lap. And then the third section, you start snapping your fingers. And then as everyone did that together, it created the sound of what? A thunderstorm, a rainstorm. That's the idea of what's happening. That's why the people have palm branches when Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, because it's consistent with the celebration of the Feast of Sukkot and their trust that God is going to provide for them. And what is it that they're singing? They're singing Hosanna and Hoshana, Hoshana, which means quite literally, Lord, help us. Lord, save us. Please, God, deliver us. Rescue us from what is happening right now. The tone of Hosanna is imperative. It is nearly a demand. God, you must rescue us. So why are the people waving these palm branches around? Well, they've co-opted this tradition from the Feast of Sukkot, and they're using it for Passover because they are so desperately hoping that Jesus will be able to do what David did. What is it they're singing? Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna to the Son of David. They're hoping that Jesus will be able, the Messiah will be able to offer them the liberty and freedom that David gave Israel. These are a people who have been enslaved for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, they last had land to call their own in the 500s BC. 586, is that what it is? Something like that. So it's been, nearly 600 years that they have been waiting. And in fact, it's worth noting they will wait another 1900 after this before they'll have a nation to call their own, a land to call their own. So Jesus and the disciples come into Jerusalem over the Mount of Olives on the morning of Passion Sunday or Palm Sunday. And for a moment, it almost seems as if perhaps this situation is not as grave as they were thinking it was going to be. Remember, Jesus had just told them one chapter earlier, Matthew 20, verse 17, he predicted for a third time that he was going to die. He was going to be killed at the hands of angry men. But when they come into the city, they don't encounter angry mobs or angry men. Instead, what they're encountering are these large numbers of people that want to make Jesus their king. They don't hate him. They love him. They're embracing him. They're lifting him up, celebrating Jesus as a Messiah. It's almost like an inauguration, if anything. The Messiah comes riding on a donkey. Now, I want to bounce over to Luke's account here because he's going to bring into this storyline something that the Pharisees see and find frustrating. So this is Luke 19, starting with verse 39. Now, some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "I tell you," he replied, "if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." And as he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes." I want to pause there. See, the Pharisees are concerned that this sort of rebellion is going to upset the status quo in Rome. Make no mistakes about it. The Jewish people do not live with freedom. They are under the thumb of Rome, and every one of their actions, every one of their words is subject to the discretion of Rome, and their life or their words can be snuffed out in a millisecond. They are praying for this deliverance. But the Pharisees are concerned that if the people get a little too out of control, Rome is going to respond with force. And so they're telling Jesus to rebuke the disciples. But Jesus is going to respond with, again, another odd statement. "I tell you the truth," he says, "if these people are quiet, the stones will cry out." Now, what might Jesus mean by this? If you've ever been to Israel, and if you haven't, I would encourage you to go. But if you've ever been to Israel, there's something almost laughable about his words here. The rocks will cry out. There are parts of Israel that is, very fertile and lush and green, at least certain times of the year. But overwhelmingly, most of Israel is all desert. And it's not desert like the deserts, that I think of, or it's not sand. It's all rocks. I mean, it's almost hilarious that Jesus says, if these people are quiet, the rocks are going to cry out, or the stones are going to cry, because that's everything. The whole country nearly is rock and stone. So is Jesus saying, if these people do not shout Hosanna to the Son of David, that the ground is going to begin to sing praises to the Lord? Is that what he's saying, that all of the earth is going to do it? Maybe. It's also worth noting that in between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount, in order to get from one to the other, you will walk a path that goes through and around and near the largest cemetery in all of Jerusalem. This is sort of the cemetery of the saints, of great Jewish leaders of history. And you can see all of their tombstones. You can see the inscriptions on them. These tombstones date back centuries and centuries and centuries. And on top of these tombstones, even today, you will see what are called like visitation rocks or visitation stones. These are stones that are left by people who visit the grave or pay tribute to some of these ancestors as a way of sort of like remembering them, but also clinging to the hope that they had. Remembrance and hope. It's similar to our tradition of placing flowers at a gravesite, but it's even more more desperate and more intense and more sincere. If you've seen the movie Schindler's List, you may remember that scene at the very end of it when a number of members of the families that were saved by Oskar Schindler are walking past his gravestone. And they're all placing these visitation stones on top of it. Some of it is just, gratitude and remembering the life of Oskar Schindler, but it's also this larger awareness about the story of the people and what God wants to do through them, what God has promised to do through them. So perhaps what Jesus is saying as he's walking by these tombstones that have all of these visitation stones on top of them, perhaps what he's saying is, if these people are quiet, the ground is going to sing praises to the Lord. But I think he's making an even more profound statement here. I think what Jesus is saying when he says, if these people are quiet, the stones will cry out. I think he's making a statement about these tombs. I think he's talking about the generations and generations of ancestors who lived their lives waiting in expectation for the Messiah, the same way that these people are. That God would send his king who would rule the earth and deliver these people, who would give them liberty and freedom once and for all in a final sense. I think what Jesus is saying is there is a hope and a roar here from these people that goes back 1,000 generations, and there's nothing that I could do or you could do that's going to shut this up. Yes, all of creation has been groaning for this moment, but it's even more than that. It's the people. It's the hopes of their ancestors. And so this scene is sort of a crowning culmination. The king is, in fact, coming into the holy city. God is, in fact, doing right now what he has promised to do. But the people of Israel did not understand what God wants to do. And so Jesus withdraws to weep, we read. He knows just how confused the people are about the real problem. They don't understand what the real problem is. They don't understand what he has come to save them from. And so he says, if only you had known this day what would bring you peace, but it's hidden from your eyes. The people wanted a revolutionary. It's interesting to note that Barabbas, who would in a few days be traded by these crowds for the life of Jesus, was a zealot. He was a rebel. He was a revolutionary. And his name is Barabbas, Bar Abbas, which actually means Bar's son, and Abbas of the Father. Barabbas is the son of the Father. And Jesus is a different sort of son of the Father. But hear me when I say this. And there's really no arguing this point if you just read the Gospels. Jesus has not come to deliver his people from their earthly suffering or from Rome or from their oppressors. And I don't know quite how we've gotten this distorted theology from the story of Jesus and the Jews, but there is no indication that he has come to save them from Roman oppression and from their earthly suffering. In fact, he says the opposite. He has not come to save them from their material needs. He's come to save them from their sins and from their sin. And this is the story that was prophesied at his birth. This is what he says throughout his life. And this is why he weeps now. Because he knows that even greater suffering awaits them. God has not come to deliver them from their earthly suffering, and their desire to force God to choose sides, to force God to take their sides against their oppressors is only going to destroy them more. Folks, liberation theology is a heresy that is not biblical. It comes from other belief systems that have been read into the Bible. But Jesus did not come to save you from your enemy, and he didn't come to save you from your neighbor. He came to save you from your sin. Your sin and your enemy's sin and your neighbor's sin. He came to save all of us from our sins, because it's our sin and our sins that creates all of the suffering and the oppression and the pain that we're so frustrated by. But we don't see our own sins, do we? All we see is the speck in the other guy's eye. And isn't it mind-blowing how dominant and pervasive this type of thinking and theology is today, even in conservative holiness churches? That God is not interested in dealing with your sin primary above all, but he is interested in relieving your earthly inconveniences and suffering and punishing the people who hurt you. Man, that's entirely inconsistent with what we see in the story of Jesus, and it's exactly why this crowd will become so unfriendly in the days to come. Look what Jesus says reading on there in verse 43. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. Jesus says, it's going to get a lot worse because you think that the way forward is the way of the sword. You think that you want to fight fire with fire. But the problem is in your heart, not your brother's. And we've got to deal with that first. All right. Now, then Jesus is going to move down the Mount of Olives and he is going to approach the Temple Mount. Let's pick this up reading on in verse 45. When Jesus entered the temple courts, he began to drive out those who were selling. It is written, he said to them, my house will be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers. You spent any time around the church, you've no doubt heard about this scene. It's often one of those episodes in the Bible where fired up, intense guys like me sometimes use it to justify our intensity or our anger. We talk about this scene as the moment when Jesus displays righteous anger. And it's true. Jesus comes up to the temple gates and the scene certainly begins to shift. He reaches the temple and, shall we say, causes a bit of a scene. When he arrives, he finds that the Sanhedrin, the religious and political authority of the Jews who are in charge of worshiping in the temple, he finds that they're stealing from the people through the system of sacrifices. Many years ago, I heard a sermon that has stuck with me for so long about this scene and what the atmosphere would have been like. For the life of me, I can't remember the exact name of the guy who preached it. But I'll never forget him telling like these examples of what it would be like to be like, let's say, a Jew or a follower of Yahweh. And you have spent your life maybe dreaming of one day going to Jerusalem during Passover to offer your sacrifices for the atonement and forgiveness of your sins. You've dreamed of one day doing it in the holy city. And imagine just the difficulty and the cost of traveling with your family anyway, and your children and all of these kosher animals. Maybe you've been traveling for weeks, maybe months, if you live outside of Israel. And when you come into the holy city, at first it's almost everything that you've expected. It's just a sight to behold. There's this palpable just energy and hum in the air, unlike anything you've seen. Modern day, I would imagine some of what it's like to be walking into a football stadium right before the kickoff of the Super Bowl. You approach the Temple Mount with your family and your animals for sacrifice when someone grabs you and they pull you aside. They're trying to be friendly, but they can tell that maybe you're confused. And they let you know that there have been some recent changes around the temple, that the temple authorities are now only allowing guests to sacrifice animals that have been purchased through the temple's own animal raising programs. You're not allowed to sacrifice your own animals anymore. In fact, you're going to have to go sell your animal to the temple authorities and then buy one of their animals if you want to offer a sacrifice for the atonement of your sin. And then when you walk up to the table where they're selling the animals and they're buying yours, right there at the gate of the temple, you're offered just a fraction of what your animals are worth. And yet the temple animals are outrageously overpriced. And there's this moment maybe where you're having a realization that the people who are running, the people who are responsible for worshiping God, who are responsible for making it possible for you to worship God, are part of this system or this business model that puts you last and is making them rich. What are you going to do about it though, right? You're a nobody, and nobody cares about nobodies. Or maybe imagine you're not a Jew, you're not even a believer, a follower of Yahweh, but you've heard stories about it. Maybe you're a Gentile or a foreigner from a distant land, hundreds of miles away. And you are coming to Jerusalem to meet with a God you've only heard stories about. A God who isn't geographical and who isn't tribal, as most ancient gods were. And from what you've heard, this God welcomes everyone. This God loves everyone. Now, by nature, you're a skeptical person and you've never really cared too much for religion. That's why you don't have a God of your own already. But there's something almost inexplicable about this God, something about this story that just rings differently. What if it's true? What if there really is, at the center of the universe, a loving, benevolent creator who loves you, wants to forgive you, and wants to set you free from all of those things that you do that are destroying you, that you know are destroying you? So against your better judgment, maybe you make the trip. You save some money, you make arrangements so that you have a significant amount of free time, and you travel to Jerusalem, to the city of peace. You're told about the system of sacrifices, that you need a sacrificial offering. So you head to, first, a table to exchange your foreign currency for local currency, for local money. You walk up to the table. Again, you are face to face with those people who are supposed to be tasked with making it possible for you to worship God. And you pull out your foreign currency and they begin to tell you their exchange rates, and perhaps you almost think they're joking at first. You can't believe your ears. These people are scam artists. This can't be real. You're offering me pennies on the dollar for local currency. And after the amount that you've already spent just trying to get there, let alone having to stay, eat, pay the temple tax, and purchase animal sacrifices for your atonement, you're not going to have enough money to make it home. You're not going to be able to do what you plan to do. It's impossible. It can't happen. I think in those moments, if it were me, my cynicism would start to take over. And I would almost begin just telling myself, I knew it, I knew it, I knew it. Everybody's the same. They're all sellouts. I thought maybe this God would be different. I thought based on what I had heard, this God might be different. But when I come to his temple to worship him, his people are looking for ways to take advantage of me. They don't have my best interest in mind. They have their best interest in mind. You've wasted months of your life chasing a God who apparently is only interested in your money. But what can you do about it? You're a nobody, and nobody cares about nobodies. And as you turn to walk away, you hear kind of like a loud crash or something maybe over your shoulder. Some sort of fight seems to have broken out, and you look over and you see this guy, and it's almost like no one wants to get near him. And he's very angry, but he's not angry the way that most people are angry. He isn't out of control. This is a righteous anger. Everything he seems to be doing is very intentional and methodical, but he's raised his voice and he is causing destruction for a reason that he thinks is justified. And he walks up to those who are selling the temple-raised animal and those who are exchanging the money, and he begins throwing their tables upside down. And he shouts in their faces, "It is written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you are making it a den of robbers." Now, Jesus is quoting from two different places in the Old Testament. First, he's quoting from the book of Isaiah 56. And I want to read it to you because I think this is important that we understand what he's trying to do. He's quoting a verse with the intention that his audience will know exactly the context of what he's referring to and will understand the words even behind the words. So, Isaiah 56, starting with verse 6. "And foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, and who hold fast to my covenant." In other words, foreigners, non-Jews, who agree to obey the commands of God, "these I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." Now, let's skip down 2 verses later, because the context of this chapter is extremely important. So, verse 10, Israel's watchmen are blind. Now, who are the watchmen of Israel? They're the shepherds of Israel. They're the people who are responsible for running worship in the temple. 1,000 years after Isaiah wrote this, they are the people who are running worship on Palm Sunday, the week of Passover. Israel's watchmen are blind. They all lack knowledge. They are all mute dogs. They cannot bark. They lie around and dream. They love to sleep. They're dogs with mighty appetites. They never have enough. They're shepherds who lack understanding. They all turn to their own way. They seek their own gain. Come, each one cries, let me get wine. Let us drink our fill of beer. And today and tomorrow will be like today, only better. Now, what is Jesus saying here when he tells the audience, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations? Well, he's quoting Isaiah 56, in which God sets these parameters in place for everybody, including foreigners who want to come to the Temple Mount to worship him. And he says, if you're willing to keep the Sabbath and honor my commands, you are welcome in this place. And then he says, but the people who are supposed to be responsible for welcoming you have created a system that is making them rich. They're making you jump through hoops. They're making you focus on things that are not the commands of God, but something else entirely. Israel's watchmen, the shepherds, care only about themselves. They don't care about the people who are coming to God. They don't care about whether or not these people understand the covenant agreements that they must obey. They only care about the money they're willing to give them for their sacrifice. My Father's house will be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers. And that second half of his statement comes to us from Jeremiah chapter 7. I need to read this as well. Now, this is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Look at verse 2. Stand at the gate of the Lord's house and there proclaim this message. Now, I want you to think about what's happening on the morning of Palm Sunday. I know some people think that Jesus flipping over the tables of the merchants happened on the morning of the Monday of Holy Week. I happen not to believe that. I think this is all one episode. I think there's good reason to believe that. But anyway, stand at the gate of the Lord's house and there proclaim this message. Now, where is Jesus standing? He is at the gate of the temple of the Lord. Reading on, hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah who come through these gates to worship the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Reform your ways and your actions. Remember, we talked about covenant obedience. Look what Jesus is referring to here. Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your ancestors, all those people whose stones are on the tombs nearby, and in the land I gave your ancestors forever and ever. But look, you are trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal and follow other gods you have not known? And then come and stand before me in this house, which bears my name, and say, we are safe to do all of these detestable things? Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers to you? But I have been watching, declares the Lord. I mean, this is an incredible indictment, and the sheer brilliance of Jesus to use these two phrases to conjure up all of these contextual messages that would have been quite clear to the rulers of the ruling authority of the tabernacle. This is to be a house of prayer, but you're turning it into a den of robbers. And do you think that you can lie and cheat and steal and create and commit perjury and follow other gods, and you can get away with it in the temple of the Lord? You think that you are safe to do these detestable things? You're not teaching people what I've told you to teach them. You're not reforming your ways or their ways. You're not dealing with each other justly. You've created a system of injustice, and you're using it to get yourself wealthy and rich. And he says, do you think that you can get away with this? I've been watching. And then look what he says, reading on, verse 12. Go now to the place in Shiloh where I first made a dwelling for my name, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. While you were doing all these things, declares the Lord, I spoke to you again and again, but you did not listen. I called, but you did not answer. Therefore, what I did to Shiloh, I will now do to the house that bears my name, the temple that you trust in, the place I gave to you and your ancestors. I will thrust you from my presence. I mean, this is just an unbelievable scene, and it's happening so quickly, playing out in real time in front of the religious leaders and all of these people who have been taken advantage of. Jesus is standing at the gate of the temple, and he's telling the people, your dishonesty, your deception, your systems to build this religious empire for yourself, it's not going to last. You and I both know what you're doing is detestable, but you've convinced yourself that you can get away with it because God favors you. And then he says, go to the place in Shiloh and see what I did there. Now, this forces us to look back to the life of King David. When David is still a boy, the book of 1 Samuel, the high priest is a man named Eli, and he has two sons who are priests, Hophni and Phinehas, but they're as crooked as the day is long. And the Israelites go into battle with the Philistines, and when they're losing, the Israelites think, we're going to go back to Shiloh where the tabernacle is and where the Ark of the Covenant is held. The Ark represents the presence of God. We're going to take it into battle, and then God will deliver us, right? We'll be safe to do all of our detestable things. God will still favor us against our enemies. But that's not what happens. They take the Ark into battle, and the Israelites are routed. In fact, it's believed that it was that day that the ark was taken from the Israelites by the Philistines into their own cities, and that the city of Shiloh, the little area of Shiloh, was razed to the ground. God will not be mocked. Now, this is a conversation about Palm Sunday, but there's so much happening on this day that's important for us to bear in mind. So many implications about the kind of kingdom that God has come to bring, the kind of salvation that he offers, and then the kind of systems that we sometimes create as his followers that are more about us and not about him. God will not be mocked. If you think that you can use the gospel and the church to serve your own self-interest, you're dead wrong. And if the shepherds of the flock are more interested in integrating with the culture that surrounds them, or they're more interested in building an empire, or the money and the wealth and the pay raises and the fame that come with it, and the warning is clear. This is going to end. The way things are is not the way that they're going to be. The Sanhedrin will be destroyed just a few decades later. After 70 AD, we never hear from them again. The city of Jerusalem is burned to the ground. Now, I think we're witnessing something very similar in Christian culture and even in our churches today. We have distorted the gospel message so that what Jesus has come to do is to oppose the people that we disagree with and not to deliver me from my sin. We think that the purpose of the gospel is to relieve my earthly suffering or to meet my material needs rather than to rescue me from the bondage of sin by which I'm held captive. Jesus came to deliver us from our brokenness, from our rebellion, from our enslavement to behaviors and mindsets and thoughts that destroy us and everything around us. And he will not stand by and watch as the people who claim to speak on his behalf are leading others astray with half gospels and heresies. Jesus says, this house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, to learn the covenant, to reform their ways, to be returned to God. It's not a den of robbers. It's not a church growth movement. It's not a social justice movement. It's not a rock concert. And listen, don't mishear me. I don't have a beef with any of those things individually. I love big churches and small churches. I want as many people as possible to find Jesus. I love meeting the needs of others. And I think we should actively be doing that as followers of Jesus, looking for ways to express the love that we have for God through us to others, to allow God's Spirit to move through us and to bless others. I think we should be trying to do that. I love great worship atmospheres. I love music and haze and lights. I love giant, beautiful buildings. I love all of it. But that is not the gospel. I want all of those things, but that's not the mission of the kingdom. That's not the gospel. Those are what the gospel produces. And it only produces it when the people of God are set free from the bondage of sin that leads them to create destructive societies and groups and churches around the world. So, on Palm Sunday, may we remember what the Savior came to save us from. Our sins. My sin, my shame. This is not an easy message to hear. We'd much rather believe that all he's got to do is get rid of our enemies and everything would be okay. Maybe it's not that hard to understand then how this crowd of cheering and celebration in just a few days would become an angry mob of death.